conversation in collaboration, change and negotiation. I spoke about the 6 leadership capabilities, and the theme that this covers is collaborating and influencing. And I'm delighted to introduce Michelle Larimar, who's Principal Lead in NHS Education for Scotland. Handing over to you, Michelle. There will potentially be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the session. So if you have any questions that come up during Michelle's presentation, please do just pop them into the chat and I'll look at them at the end. So handing over to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny, and welcome to everyone. It's great to see so many of you being able to join today. Jenny, could you just, I'll put on my presentation and share if that's okay. Excellent. So, give me 2 seconds. So today's session, what I'm going to say as the presentation comes up, and I'm looking for a thumbs up from Jenny because she's a lovely face I can see at the moment. Can you see that? Brilliant. Is a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and it is bringing to you a number of different tools, techniques that actually might help a lot. So this is what I'm aiming to get through today. So this was shared with me by a colleague who should have been presenting from NHS Lothian, Jerry. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it today, but actually, when I asked Jerry, how does this work? He says it's usually a half day. So what I'm going to do is give you an essence of some of the things that might help with your thinking around this topic and around the conversations that you have to have. And so what I'm going to ask you to do, first of all, is just pause. Let's slow down for a minute. You may be joining us over your lunch break or something else. So let's just take a moment to think about a scenario or a situation that you will ponder on as we go through this conversation, and that you will think about in terms of the tools, the thoughts that I'm going to share with you. And just consider whether these prompt a different thought process for you, whether you find it maybe helpful to the situation that you're in, and that whether that can help your thinking or your approach to these conversations. So a real mixture of things here. I'm just going to check, can everyone hear Darian? Is that okay for everyone? Yeah, okay. Just I see there's some issues for people. Brilliant. So pause. Think about a conversation that you may have in your head or a situation at work that you're dealing with that you can, as you hear about these different aspects, consider. And I think that might help some of your thinking. So let's move on to consider what can make this difficult. So for us, there's a number of things around this. We're human. We're different. We've had different backgrounds, different upbringings, different work experiences. We see the world differently. And with that then comes a different lens, a different perspective, a different thought process. And I'll come to that a little bit next. And we have our own preferences of how we like to work, how we like to show up, how we like to be treated, all of this. Add into that we have in our heads a brain, which has a old primitive brain system that is geared for that fight or flight mode. And that's good because it's there to protect us. It's there to make quick decisions to help us in this world, because actually, my God, we have so much going on that we need some quick routes in there to get us to a point of thought or an answer or a solution. So we have that, and then we have this new brain, and it's the new brain that we're going to try and tap into by bringing a bit of pause, a bit of space, a bit of choice, a bit of self-awareness, a bit of reflection that will hopefully slow us down in our thinking, that can help us with these difficult conversations and negotiations that we have. But it's all quite natural, that whether we're in flight mode, which might be show up as being withdrawing or withholding or avoiding or opting out, or maybe deflecting or disappearing, or whether it's that we have a go-to, which is that fight mode, that insisting, that demanding, that controlling, that berating, and can be bullying at times. And these things are different at different points, and it's about us. Often this shows up when we're feeling unsafe, And that can be unsafe in how we approach the conversation or who's in front of us and how we're feeling about it, how things are in that day, that moment, the context in which this conversation is happening. So much is going on for us. So much in those moments, our brains are occupied. And some of what I'm trying to introduce is about that. How do we slow down to give a bit more consideration? That might not always be possible. So our old brain, or that limbic brain, helps us make quick decisions because sometimes we're in roles where that needs to happen. But how, when it matters, when we've got the time, how do we slow that down? So, as I say, a whistle-stop tour, but pause and think, what might that mean for me? What makes this difficult for me as I think about that conversation? So for those that have just joined, try and think about a conversation or a situation that you're working with. And as we talk through this whistle-stop tour, what's showing up for you? What are you pondering about? Where is it leading your thinking? And for you, what makes that conversation difficult? And one of the things that you may already be aware of, so what I might be bringing to you is things that you already know, and or they could be new things. So if it's new, listen in. If it's something you've already heard, maybe deepen your thinking or reflect on actually, how have I used that in the past? Have I used it? Was it useful? Think about these things. So Ladder of Inference is based on Chris Agrell's work, and it is there for a reason, that we are complex beings. I mean, imagine it, our body functions, our heart beats, we breathe without thinking. It's all quite amazing that our brains provide us with a means to have a shortcut to get us there. I read somewhere once, I think, that we've got in the day an ability to make 600 decisions. I'll need to find the research behind this, but if you think about that, that then can influence how we are on a day and how we react and how we handle things. So it's useful just to think about, sometimes it is helpful that we have that quick solution, that quick response, and sometimes we need to think. And I suppose these conversations that you've come today to think about are those ones where maybe we need to take a little bit more time. But let me talk you through this theory. So this theory is that we bring in this quick process, if you want, that we observe and have observable data. And then internally, we filter that. Internally, we have stories behind that. We have assumptions and we make conclusions, and there's beliefs that we draw upon, and there's actions that we take. And the only two observable pieces are the observable data at the start and the actions that we take. And add into this mix that there is then this reflexive loop that actually it becomes a bit ingrained, because actually our brains are making that short synopsis between one and the other. So let me talk about this in a bit more detail, but just think about it, that the only two bits that are observable to someone else is that situation and the action that we take. And a lot of the else of it is that internal thought process, that quick brain. So observable data is what is going on in front of us, the situation. And I'll give you an example in a second. But in every day, what we do is we have what is going on in front of us and we filter it selectively. And this isn't a bad thing. If we consciously identified every sensory data available, we'd be completely overwhelmed. So it's there for good reason. But then we add meanings to that data that we've selected. This is where we start to interpret what the data is telling us. Meanings might be cultural or personal. We might match the data with familiar patterns. We might base them on our own mental models or the view of the world that we have. And this may not relate to the other experiences that we've had with specific people, or it could, or it might not. And usually we have emotions attached to those experiences, and they come back to us now. And then we fill in the gaps. So we make assumptions based on those past experiences, and we respond to the emotional feelings. If we don't know something, we might make an assumption to fill that gap. It's quite natural to do that. And based on those assumptions, we draw conclusions. And we reach those conclusions using our preferred decision model and approach. I know that I take a very logical approach to things. It's black, it's white sometimes. It's helpful, makes a quick decision. It's not always useful though. And for example, it might be based also on our values or experience. And again, that's got a reaction to it. And we adopt beliefs around the world in which we are based on those conclusions. So as you see, what we've got is from that observable data, it's this building up of a picture, but it's all done in a second. It's all done in a moment because our brains are doing it for us. And then that's where the reflexive loop comes in, that then we're back into, if that happens again, we've almost created that pattern for us, so it shortens our thinking. It doesn't bring a moment of pause. And therefore we're short-circuiting it. We're leaping to conclusions without awareness of everything that's going on in our head or in between. And those emotions that are associated with our recent conclusions are then fed into future meanings. So some general points about this before I give the example. As I said, all the runs, apart from observable data and action, take place in our head. And we don't often remember where our deepest attitudes come from or where those meanings we add to them, because that's lost in our memory. And after years of leaps of abstraction from bottom to top, we reinforce this through that reflexive loop. And so to improve the conversations that we have, we need to make our own thinking processes either more visible. We need to find a way in which we differentiate between our perceptions and our thinking and compare that with the person that perhaps we're having a conversation with and check in where there's commonality. So there's something about actually how do we check those assumptions? How do we check the stories that we're telling? How do we work with that? So I'm going to give you an example of, imagine a meeting. It's a multidisciplinary meeting. I'm trying to make this as vague and as relevant to as many of you as possible because I've got 133 who work in very different roles and jobs. And say in that meeting you're discussing the care or the situation for a particular individual or patient. And Ashley's presenting their views. And the others all seem to be engaged and listening intently. And at one point, Sam looks away, puts their hand over their mouth when Ashley is about to finish. And then Sam says, I think we need more information. So that's the observable data. But I'm Ashley, and I've just filtered that to think Sam looked away and seemed to yawn. They interrupted and asked for more information. So the story I tell myself is Sam wants me to finish. I've assumed they're bored. And another assumption I might be making is Sam doesn't agree with my opinion and the information I have based this on because they're asking for more information. And then the conclusion I draw is that they think I'm incompetent, or the belief I form is that Sam is opposed to me. And therefore the action I take is I will protect myself by taking action against Sam. So you can see how quickly, and if you think that the only thing that's observable is what happened in the room and then the action I took against Sam, how that may be misconstrued or how we might view that. So pause to think about the conversation or the situation you have in your head. Think about that space, that place that you've been in and what that conversation meant. And what was going on for you? What were you filtering? What assumptions were you drawing? What conclusions were you making? What stories were you telling yourself? And this is not a linear ladder of going up and down. This is not you just go up one run and you come back, you reflective. So you move up and down this. So again, think about that. Again, there will be more, and you can Google this work, and we can probably find you an article that we can direct you to where you can have a bit more. And in fact, I think Darianne has a video link. So as we go through this, there we go. As we go through this, you'll find some links put in there that gives you a little bit more to think about. But just pause and think about what that means for the conversation that you have in mind. And I spoke earlier about why do these things make a difference, and the bit I'm going to move on to now is that actually we all have our own preferences. So I don't know, throughout your careers you may have used some of these tools. You might have done Kaler's drivers, you might have done Myers-Briggs type indicator or an insights tool, you might have used STI. There's numerous tools out there, or you might have just done some online questionnaire. Maybe not from a magazine, but those sort of things. So anyway, do we have insights into what are our strengths, how we can understand ourselves under stress, what are our go-tos, what are our blind spots, how do we restore ourselves? So what is our preference? Because the more we can understand about ourselves, the more we can think about how we turn up, how we show up, what that might mean for others, what we might need from others, and what might they need from me, and how do I express myself? Am I a please people or am I be strong? And that'll have a different reaction to how we behave. If you've done that one, that's the Kaler's one, which again, Darianne's just posted in the chat. But it's just thinking, how much do I know about my way of working, my preferences, how that shows up, how that might be for others. And particularly when we're in times of stress, that can sometimes be somewhat exaggerated. So again, how do we create and be the best that we want to be when we're having these conversations? So again, ponder on, think about what that means in terms of your situation, your conversation that you're thinking about. And then let's just put the shoe on the other foot, because often what we think is the person that we've got to have a conversation with is really difficult. That they're, oh, what's the term that people use? I've got a challenging person, a challenging member of my team. But actually, we can be seen as difficult. And what might make you difficult at work? I'm going to take a moment. Feel free to share in the chat. I know that I am a stickler for my own ways. I like a bit of structure. I'm a very logical, practical thinker, and that's both at home and at work. And actually that sometimes rubs people up the wrong way. I'm really good with a red pen if you give me a report, and maybe that's not what someone needs. So again, that's thinking about how might we be perceived to be seen as difficult at work? What is it that we show up with? And we need to work from the basis that actually nobody is, if you go back to we all have different perspectives, I always make the assumption that nobody comes to work to harm. Everyone is reasonable, but sometimes we need to understand that what is behind those reasons, what is behind that. So I'll pause there again for a second. And I'm assuming that we're not difficult people because there we go, we're all reasonable. Nothing in the chat there that I'm picking up. Okay, so it's just thinking, how do I view that other person? Again, what assumptions am I making? Oh, there we go, Jenny, thank you. Coming in to say she's a rescuer. She's coming into my rescue here. So yeah, so driven by performance, quick to act, but treat everyone fairly. Yeah, and that might mean that people feel like I'm not on their side. Thank you for that. But those are the things to think about as we think about some of these conversations. Okay, so let's move on to some of the fundamental skills that are around us. And this is maybe what you came for. Everyone likes a bit of a skill, a tool, a technique that we might help us through this. And this is based on Getting to Yes, which is written by Yuri Fisher and Patton. And the book was called in its full title, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In. And the focus on moving away from that win-lose negotiation that we sometimes find ourselves in, and that caving in, that sometimes we cave in maybe, or sometimes we stand our ground because we need to win. So there's something about how do we find a different way in which we can, and some of the tools and techniques we're going to talk about is how can you get to that win-win situation. And it's there's an article there again I found which is sort of gives you sort of some guidance and guidelines that you might want to explore later in a bit more detail, because again we're going to give you a very sort of whistle-stop tour to this. So as you can see, they're given 5 elements here around this, and the first one is quite simple, is around that really separate the people from the problem. So rather than seeing someone as challenging as an individual, it's leaning into actually what is the information, what is it that they are showing up with, how are they presenting, what is the emotions and the conflict that is behind that, but actually separate it, what is the issue that you're dealing with. Because as we've explored earlier, all humans and as such have feelings, opinions and values, and we show up differently, and this contributes to how we all show up. And so remember that if we focus in on the situation, consider the counter view, what the counter view might be is what they suggest we do in this space. So thinking about if there's, what other perspectives might there be to this issue? Where does that lead my thinking? How else might I see it? I often see this as a sort of diamond shape, if you want, and if you were to change it and take it from different perspectives, or others allude to, then there's a book of about the cheese, about actually if you see a lump of cheese, some might see it as a square, some see it as a triangle. So actually, how can we see this problem from a different perspective other than just our own? And again, pause, ponder, think about your own scenario? Have you been able to separate the problem from the people? It can be quite hard to do. Okay. Which leads me on to the focus on interests and not positions. And I'm going to play a little bit of video here. It's going to be tiny in the corner, and I'm going to ask you just to really lean into the listening. And it's about understanding that actually positions are the perceived solution that people have. And mostly those are negatively formed. I want them to stop. I can't work that way. And actually, if we just lean into actually what is the unmet need, what is their interest behind us, and try and get into that a little bit more to understand what is behind that anger or that frustration, what is that position and why are they taking that position up? And we might find that there's a little bit more. But here's someone that can explain it in a very short way. So I'll be quiet. I'm going to put myself on mute and then you can hear it. Oh, actually. know, he beautifully gets that across about actually, if we just show a bit of more exploration around the situation, move away from our position, pause, slow down, because that looked a bit like the knife was coming out and you were worried there. So, again, it's like getting to that point where we're thinking about how can we acknowledge, explore, explain, and maybe encourage people to have a different type of conversation. So again, because this is a whistle-stop tour, I'm just going to let you think for a moment about actually thinking about the conversation you got. Where's your focus? Is it on the interests, or is it that you have a position or you feel that they have a position, and how might you explore that with the other person or people? Okay. So the other elements of the Getting to Yes book is around preparation. So actually spending some time thinking about your own position, your own interests, those of other parties. So that thinking a bit more around other options, what is possible. And that might be around having the data and the information that's driving this. So again, staying out of the personal and then more into the actual factual space of the problem. And considering again how you might voice this. I mean, you picked up there that sometimes the tone, the questions are really important. So if we thought through what we want to ask, have we considered how we might do that? Whether that's in person, are we doing it through an email? Where might we get lost in translation? How might we approach that differently? What has worked in the past? What hasn't worked in the past? Again, think about how you prepare for these conversations, what you have done in the past. And then again, I suppose it comes down to very much the work that we talk about in leadership is around those relationships and maintaining that positive way in which we can work with each other, even in such times difficult that we're all going through just now. Be that in relation to our staffing or our budgets, or just in general well-being, life, etc. So again, thinking about how are our relationships, how are we viewing the other person, are we being as open and transparent as we can be, are we creating that ability to have a collaborative and more problem-solving approach, because that can help us where there is maybe low trust. We always know that it can be quite difficult to build that, but how do we explore that? How do we show up as leaders in that space to create that atmosphere that can, even in the most difficult times, build rapport and maintain that? And most importantly, and I made you lean in and listen there deeply, is actually how are we using our listening? The old adage of we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, so actually what are we doing in that space? And I was on something yesterday which was talking about where it's maybe a colleague, a staff member and a manager conversation. The rule should be 30-70. Actually, as a manager or a leader, we should be talking 30% of the time and allowing others to voice theirs and listen deeply. Often I think we are downloading, and I know that's my go-to, is I am downloading, but I'm already thinking of my response. So am I truly listening in to that conversation? Am I picking up those nuances? Am I checking back? Am I listening in for those facts about what difference? What am I accessing that open mind? Am I thinking about noticing what is fitting, what's working? Am I being empathetic in my listening? Am I trying to understand the other person's point of view? Or am I just exerting my own point of view? So thinking about that, what's my intention when I show up? Is it to tell, or is it actually to truly sit down and negotiate and listen and think and consider options that are available? And it can be difficult to do. And I think that's the bit that we need to also think about in the context in which we're working. Have we created the right space? Have we got the right time? Are we in the right place? Are we rushing between things and therefore actually probably more in that downloading mode? Or actually are we creating opportunities to delve into where, if this is a very important conversation that we need to have, are we setting it up well? And are we thinking about the way in which we are reflecting back or reframing what we're listening to check in about what we've heard? So are we feeding into that to say, I'm hearing this, is that right? Are we being quiet and waiting for and recognizing. So that generative listening that we need to connect the possibilities that we might have. Are you shifting in that thinking about your listening and that sense of self? And thinking about that a bit deeper. So am I truly listening, or am I listening to respond? And again, think about your circumstances and your situations. So some of you maybe are familiar with transactional analysis. It's based on 1950s theory. It's not new. And again, it's just a theory and a concept. It can sometimes help us think about the conversations that we're having. And it was developed by Eric Berne, and he viewed transactions, those conversations that we have, those interactions that we have, in sort of 3 different ego states. And the aim for us is, in these good conversations, is to remain in that adult space, the here and now, the data and the facts. Again, that goes back to that original point. Are we looking at the problem? Are we considering the facts that are in front of us? And again, these are sort of thinking about the quick fix. I mean, the parent can be helpful, it can be a nurturing parent, but actually, are we turning up and showing up as a more controlling parent, setting limits and guidelines, stopping, defining, and directing? The nourishing and nurturing parent turns up as someone who's nourishing and encouraging, but that can exact a reaction, which is to place people into that child ego state, where we either become and abide by rules and instructions and conform to etiquette, or it can lead to the free child, which is uncentered, spontaneous, can be, storming off, whatever, so think about that childlike state that we can find people in, that we might have in our workplace, and where is that coming from? And that might be about their reaction to how we are. And it is about staying in that adult space where we're drawing on the environment in which we're working, where we are keeping our parent and child mind states sets in check, where we're using non-judgmental language. I believe, it seems, I'm wondering. So all that keeps us in that state, and it's absolutely necessary that if we want to work in and negotiate, that we are remaining in that space. And to sort of emphasize this is that often what you show up and do, so if you come at it with a parental, if you want, or parent attitude of directing, you will get a childlike response, and vice versa. So how do we show up and remain in that adult space, and it can be difficult, because if others are trying to play a game and move you into those responses and reactions, how do we maintain that? And that links to, and again, you may have heard of this or seen this before, I know with some people, but that can link into games and plays, and more links into what can be perceived a bit of drama triangle. So developed by a student of Eric Berne, the Cartman, around the TA, they're thinking about there can be players in this. So how are we showing up? Sometimes we are trying to be helpful and rescue, and actually that's not what's required, and that can have its own impact. Or we are the victim of, this isn't working, this isn't helping. So again, do you see this being played out? Are you the person who's exerting yourself and maybe perceived in this model as a persecutor, and actually just thinking, well, how do I step away from this? How do I remain in that adult space and have this conversation? So again, thinking about your scenario, think about whether some of these elements are playing up, and you move between them. So it's not static. It's not that you're always in victim. You move around, because actually, if you're in victim mode and you think, well, actually, that's not the solution I wanted, you could soon be into the persecuting the person who came up with the rescue for you. So again, it's thinking this is a dynamic. It's just again another model to think about in your conversation. What might be showing up? What might be happening? And that there is actually a way in which you can come out of that, and that's to remain in that adult state where you can be in what can sometimes be termed the winner's circle. So not being a rescuer, but instead asking people and listening in and being self-aware about where you get to. Yeah, and thank you, Michaela. Often just asking, how can I help, can help that move and shift. And it's being vulnerable. I don't know all the answers. Are you willing to help me? Can you help my thinking? So again, sometimes when we're in these negotiation circumstances, we feel that we need to show up, that we know everything, or that we know, or we fill the gaps. Again, going back to that ladder of inference, are we filling in gaps here? And actually, rather than leaning into a vulnerability, which is actually, I don't think I know everything about this, can you tell me a little bit more? So are you listening and exploring? Are you asking the questions? Are you using your logic? Is it true? Is it false? Probable? Possible? Do you know your own triggers? Do you know your own preferences? Do you have a preference to please people? Do you have a preference to be strong? Whatever it is. So again, thinking about how you might bring some of this to your conversations. I'll pause there for a moment. So we're nearing the end, and I'm quite keen that we do maybe have time for some questions. So I'm going to just bring in some quick tools. And again, you can find more information about that elsewhere. So some of you may have been on coaching for managers courses, or are actually coaches. And so sometimes there's models around that GROW model, but we've changed this slightly to focus more on the options. So that creating of options that we talked about earlier, about actually how do we bring to this model. And again, it's not that you start at goal and always move around it. It's a flexibility about actually what is the topic we'd want to talk about. Are you talking about in that goal about the concerns that you have about this? Is it about getting to the bottom line? Is it how you prefer it to be? What is the reality? Exploring that. So what's my reality? What's yours? Because again, that different perspective, seeing it from different places. Describe the situation. Tell me a little bit more about that. And you might also then think about, well, what options do we have? Or what obstacles are there in our way is another way of thinking about this. So again, thinking about those conversations. Have you brought some of this to those conversations, those negotiations, and thinking about it? And then finally, the will, if you want. What's my part in this? How will we get this going? What action will we take? And there's often something in this about actually having the other person articulate what they're taking from this conversation. Again, that's slowing it down, checking that we're on the same page, that we've got similar thinking. It can be really a useful model where you can take some control and structure to it, be in a team meeting or an agenda, but where you can also help others think through and not rescue, but actually get them to think a bit more about what might they want to be achieving, what are we trying to gain from this conversation. And again, we can post later, I've got some sort of quick questions that you can go to that might be helpful. You know, the reality of what's happening just now, what's here, what's going on. So again, there's a bit more to this in terms about some of the questions that we might ask and reframe, and how we might explore this in a different way. It will depend on your situation, very much so. And another tool or a way to think about things is, and again, going back to that ladder of inference, about it can also help us think about, how are we dealing with those sort of microaggressions about actually, did I hear that properly? Again, listening into that, listening a bit. How am I showing up? Was I just downloading? So how can I slow down to say, actually, what did the person actually say? What were the words that they used? And how can we paraphrase that back or check that? So I thought I heard you saying ... And I found that frustrating. Is that what you said? Is that what you meant? So again, what impact is that having on me as I hear this? And am I basing this on assumption? Or am I making assumption? And how can I check that back with the other person? So again, just some simple tools. And again, I think the slides can be shared and you'll see this recording. You can go back to later. Sometimes these are questions that are useful just to consider in your situations. There's also a tool, and this is a tool that became, certainly was in my mediation training as a mediator, about actually with non-judgment, how can we use this tool to describe what we're experiencing or what we're hearing, and explain the impact that's having. So that touching into that feeling sense or the thinking sense that you have, again, using neutral language. And that's where the preparation can sometimes need to come in, that if you were thinking about this conversation, how do you keep that with a neutral language, not blaming? And explaining how then you recognise your own feelings and not speaking for others. So one of the key things is sticking with I. So I think. Sometimes when we go to you, that can get a reaction from people. And thinking about how you might communicate that in an alternative way. So there's one example, you know, about it, but you might be sort of describing the behavior with statements like when I hear, when I see, when happens, when this happens. And you might be explaining that I feel or I am, but you also might then show that understanding and recognizing the feeling. I can see, I can understand that, I can hear. And then it's specifying or communicating your ask or your need. I would appreciate if, I need, I'd like. Again, that tone is really important that they spoke about in that positions and interests video. And then communicating your request. So again, just thinking about some of these simple sort of step processes about thinking about the conversation. And that can be hard in the moment. So there's something about how do we practice that? And you can practice it in the positive as well. So again, think about if you're giving someone good feedback, you might use this, and that way we can practice and get into good habits. But there is something about how can we use this? Another example might be, so describing when you tell me there is nothing wrong, and then I'm confused because I've noticed the difference in you. And then specifying, I can see you may be reluctant to discuss this. And then the consequence of the communication of that. So can I ask you to help me to understand what's caused this change? So again, that's slowing down, that non-judgmental, staying where you are. Okay. Only a couple more slides to go. And another one, again, and some of you may be familiar with this, is CPR, so that content pattern. And for this case, we've changed it to repercussion, but it could also be relationships. So again, it's thinking about that in that event, you're dealing with it on the first occasion about the content. You seem upset when we propose this change. Can you tell me about it a little bit more? And again, just getting their perspective. If you keep noticing it over time, again, it's saying, I notice, and you're noticing the pattern. I'm noticing that this keeps happening. Can we talk about this? You're in a different space. But actually, as this continues, you notice that there is the language that allows you a way in, that you're not going straight into the repercussions, but you're actually trying to build up that relationship and maintain that rapport. But by the final one, you're actually voicing your concern, the risk around this, the repercussions. Now, it may not be the 5th time, and it may all happen in one meeting. So again, think about your scenarios. Think about, does this resonate? Is this useful? Or is there something else? It may not be useful this time, but thinking about, I'm struggling to manage this. I'm worried if we cannot do this. So do you think about actually the language that we use, not just about what you're saying, but how you're saying it, and actually how you might articulate where is you as a leader are struggling or finding it difficult. So it might be in that relationship space, I'm finding it hard to manage the service when you're not here and the team are struggling. I need you to. So something like that. So again, that's once you get to the 5th time, but trying to build that understanding, trying to see a different perspective and see what that person can do. And again, it can relate back to that grow model of not taking ownership, but actually asking whether, what's the reality of the situation? What options do you have? So again, these can all interlink and interplay. So it's useful to look back on them. And you may already, as I say, be aware of these. And one of the key things is about that reframing. So actually hearing something, processing it, and then reframing it back. So again, bringing a bit more of changing negative statements if you can. And it's not dismissing what the other person has said, but actually just picking up on what they're talking about and trying to identify that common ground in those interests. And trying to move from a blaming or a negative statement, so moving away from that victim in that drama triangle, but into that adult space. And it's reducing the blame, maybe acknowledging the feeling behind the behaviour or the voicing that you've heard. So you might think that when you do this, there's some key things to do. So avoiding the why, as it was spoken about earlier. Instead going, I'm curious, I'm interested. What's your intention? Don't ask too many leading questions too soon. Don't pry. Maybe just, just a little bit of more information would be helpful here, and trying to encourage people. So think about how we might, in the moment, think about some of the things that we've done in reframing.